In Anna Gross's fascinating article for the Financial Times this morning about Tom Tugendhat's Conservative leadership bid and his critique of Sir Keir Starmer, she looks at Tugendhat's strategy to position himself as a strong and decisive leader that the country needs in the middle of this far right-wing violence. And the question really is whether her assessment of his approach is accurate, whether his approach is reasonable, whether this strategy will help Tugendhat secure the mainstream vote, and whether this will indeed lead to a recovery of the Conservative Party, should he succeed in the leadership nomination, and should the wider Conservative Party faithful then vote for him over whoever his adversary would be, presumably somebody from the far right, somebody like Priti Patel. Would Tugendhat have the power to eclipse Priti Patel? I'm not sure he would. Anna Gross highlights his pointed criticism of Starmer, which is an interesting angle, particularly accusing him of being too slow to respond to the recent wave of far-right violence. Actually, it seems to me that Starmer responded about as quickly as any leader could in the circumstances. Tugendhat contrasts his own vision of leadership with what he describes as Starmer's cautious, lawyerly approach. By doing so, Tugendhat is attempting to appeal to voters who crave decisive action at a time of crisis. But a time of crisis, remember, we have a rather cheapened understanding of the word crisis. The real word crisis in Greek means a decision, and taking a decision and then standing by it. It's not something one should do speedily. Starmer did it significantly faster than I expected. His reference to David Cameron's handling of the 2011 London riots serves to underline his argument that effective leadership requires swift and robust intervention. However, it's essential to consider whether his critique is entirely fair or merely a political tactic. My own instinct is that his pause was enough to allow someone like Farage to creep into the narrative. It wasn't long enough to cause a lopsided and inappropriate response. It simply gave room for somebody else who was quicker off the mark and more salacious in their questioning to kick off rather than kick in. Starmer's decision to convene Cobra 6 days after the violence began could be seen as a measured approach, prioritizing thorough assessment over rash action. And Gross's review suggests that Tugendhat is trying to paint Starmer as weak and indecisive, but this might be an oversimplification. Well, it is an oversimplification. Starmer's approach resonates with voters who value caution and due process in leadership, particularly after the example of Liz Truss's scurrilous and speedy nonsense. Gross points out that Tugendhat's speech is designed to appeal to the One Nation Tory members and centrists within the party, and she's right. By criticising Starmer's handling of the riots and emphasising his own law and order credentials, Tugendhat is positioning himself as the only candidate who can best counter the growing populist threat from Farage's Reform UK party. His refusal to make a deal with Reform or allow Farage to enter the Conservative Party is also a clear signal to mainstream Conservative voters that he represents a clear moderate alternative to the far right. Yet while Tugendhat's tough stance on law and order might attract some voters, it's unclear whether this will be enough to secure the leadership nomination. Or indeed, once he's got that, to secure the votes he needs from the wider party. The Conservative Party is deeply divided, with some factions leaning towards that more populist hard-right stance, and Tugendhat's refusal to engage with Farage could alienate these voters, particularly limiting his appeal within the broader party. And Gross correctly identifies Tugendhat's strategy as an attempt to differentiate himself from both his rivals and from Starmer. But this strategy will resonate with mainstream electoral, with the mainstream electorate. I think Tugendhat is right. Tugendhat is taking the correct approach. and there is no uncertainty about that. His critique of Starmer, however, while sharp, might not fully resonate with voters who are more concerned about economic issues, public services, and Brexit challenges than with law and order. And I think the combination of Tugendhat and Stride's firm rebuke of Farage for questioning the police, questioning law and order, is really decisive. The risk for Tugendhat is that his attack on Starmer may be perceived as opportunistic, especially if voters feel that the Prime Minister's approach to the riots was justified. And today, the story of the 13-year-old who was punching, 13-year-old girl who was punching people outside an asylum hotel, the man, the beady-eyed man in glasses, John Honey, who was caught looting Lush. Starmer's approach resonates with the people, particularly when those photographs are plastered around the newspapers and on the BBC, exposed, ridiculed, and held in contempt. And Starmer is standing above that. The violence may well have complex origins, but it is reduced to these simplistic images of people who have been caught behaving badly. And that resonates. And, you can't but approve of Starmer's decision on that, and the fact that he is supported by the media helps. Tugendhat's focus on law and order will appeal, but it may be seen as a narrow platform in a leadership race where broader economic and social policies are just as important. Anna Gross's review of Tugendhat's leadership bid is insightful in highlighting his strategic positioning and his critique of Starmer. But while his approach may bolster his image as a strong leader, it's not without its risks. His focus on law and order, his refusal to engage with populist elements within the party, that puts Tugendhat and Stride in the same camp, and that's very positive. Tugendhat has a little bit more experience. He says, Anna says, Tugendhat said that if Starmer had chaired a daily meeting of the crisis group from the outset of the disorder, as then Tory Prime Minister David Cameron had done in the 2011 riots in London, police forces would have had more of what they needed. They could have cancelled leave, extended mutual aid, confronted the rioters earlier with an overwhelming police presence. All she's doing here is quoting Tugendhat, and he's right. But I'm not sure necessarily, in the end, the criticism of Starmer is reasonable. Tugendhat, Stride, and James Cleverly are all occupying that centre ground. James Cleverly, of course, is heavily tarred with his association with Suella Braverman and the Home Office. So I think James Cleverly can probably be ruled out. And, of course, he's associated with his expressions like batshit. So, again, I don't think James Cleverly comes across as a serious contender. Mel Stride, I think, probably comes across as somebody that we don't know. Tugendhat is the front runner for the middle ground. And whether his speech helps him secure that mainstream vote and the leadership nomination will depend on how well he can balance his tough on crime stance with the broader public proposals that address the pressing issues facing the country. If he can convince the Conservative Party that he's not only a strong leader but also a unifying figure capable of addressing the diverse concerns of the electorate and bringing the party together, then his chances will improve. But if his strategy is seen as too narrowly focused and picking a fight where one doesn't really exist, it may not be enough to carry him through to victory.